Hello, I'm Grin Grimsly, and welcome to the first episode of the second season of Grin Reviews. In the last season of the show, we reviewed Centipede on the Atari 2600, and we figured what better way to kick off the second season than with the sequel of the game. So today we'll be looking at Millipede for the Atari 2600. When I was reviewing Centipede, I likened it to Starship Troopers. Hopefully the sequel of the game is nothing like the sequel of the movie, because Starship Troopers 2 was an absolute stinker. Anyway, let's puff in the cartridge and have a look at the game.
Playing this game has got me thinking, what makes a sequel into a good sequel? Well, in a world in which everything seems to get a sequel no matter how undeserving, I feel that our requirements have become somewhat lax. These days we would consider a good sequel to be something that wasn't too much worse than the original thing it's sequeling. But what about in a perfect world? What about a world in which terrible movies like The Last Airbender were not getting sequels? Well, then I feel that we could lift up our requirements on what a good sequel was a little bit higher. So, in this hypothetical paradise of a world, what would make a good sequel into a good sequel? Well, firstly, the storyline would have to either be a good continuation of the original story or continuing it in an interesting new way. The graphics, of course, would have to either be better or at least resemble them in some ways, making improvements in areas where the original had lapsed, while still successfully emulating the feel and look of the original. And not unlike the graphics, the sound would also have to either emulate or improve on its original. In an absolutely perfect world, a good sequel needs to be better, funner, and more interesting than its original. And perhaps most importantly, it needs more of that intangible factor that makes things fun and enjoyable. So does Millipede have all of those things over Centipede? Well, in short, yes it does. And in long, well, still yes, but I'm going to tell you why. If you remember my review of Centipede, I didn't like the storyline in the manual, and I instead chose to disregard it and believe it was about Starship Troopers. Well, this game didn't come with the manual. Well, I'm sure it did, but the copy I got didn't come with a manual, so I don't know the storyline. And I seem to remember the storyline in Centipede was so crappy that no storyline is better than a storyline, so I'm going to give that a vote of confidence that this storyline is better than the first. So now that we've established that Millipede has a better storyline than Centipede, let's move on to the graphics. A simple side-by-side comparison should blow your mind. It certainly blew my mind when I went straight from playing Centipede to remind myself how it was to playing Millipede. What you're seeing right now is Centipede on the left side of the screen and Millipede on the right side of the screen. There are obvious similarities between the two games. In fact, you could probably be convinced that they are the same game at different stages. So you may very well be asking, Grin, what is so mind-blowing about the difference here? Well, to oversimplify the situation, they are not the same game at different stages, but instead two different games, with the one on the left being Centipede and the one on the right being Millipede. That might sound like I'm stating the obvious, but the thing is it is a very important distinction because at no point and at no stage does Centipede ever look or feel like Millipede. You see on the Centipede side of the screen you have the Centipede coming down that breaks into fragments when you blast it and a spider to look out for, which when you're playing Centipede and you've only played Centipede is a lot to deal with. And while occasionally there is that little thing that runs across the screen which offers you more points if you kill it, you are only having to track the Centipede segments and the spider. As you get further and further in the game, these things speed up and are harder to deal with. So when you're playing Centipede and have only played Centipede, these two threats are more than enough to get your adrenaline pumping and more than enough to keep your attention occupied. However, with all due respect given to Centipede, and don't get me wrong, it does deserve all due respect, Centipede is a great game, but with all due respect, when the threats you face in Centipede are put side by side with Millipede, they just look laughable. In Millipede, we have the two additional threats, one of which is a X that comes down at you, swooping at you, which may or may not be some sort of plane, or possibly a dragonfly, or maybe even an X-Wing, and the second threat of a death hamster. That's right, you heard me correctly, we are threatened by a death hamster. I of course do not own the manual, so I cannot be certain that it is a death hamster, but if you've ever seen a hamster and you've ever seen death, then just by looking at this little guy you can tell that it is in fact a death hamster. At this point you might be thinking simply adding two new additional enemies can't possibly add to the difficulty and hectic feel of the game that much. But may I remind you that to begin with, we only had 2 enemies in Centipede, so they've essentially doubled the threat level in Millipede. And the fact that the death hamster runs across the bottom of the screen and then jumps up towards your little square when you get near it, while simultaneously the X is coming down from above and swooping towards your character, means that you're constantly having to watch out from all sides. On top of these 2 main enemies, you also get a few extra things running around on the screen. For instance, occasionally you have raining down from the skies bees or golden snitches or something. These things give you extra points if you kill them, so they sort of work as a bonus round for extra points. However, these points are not free because these things come down very fast, and if they hit you, you do die, so you're basically playing chicken for them. It's a very good risk and reward thing. However, as I said in the previous video, the only good bug is a dead bug. And yes, before you ask, a death hamster does count as a bug. Look it up. And the game developers, clearly echoing that sentiment, have given us a new way of killing the bugs. Scattered around the screen are these little cubes that say DT or DVT or something on them. I'm not really sure what DT or DVT stands for, but the fact of the matter is if you manage to shoot one of these boxes, they explode. And just like Missile Command, that explosion kills anything that runs into it. So if you manage to trigger it just before a centipede goes past it, you manage to wipe out the entire centipede in one beautiful glory bloom of death. So with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and assume that DT stands for dead things. On top of this, there's another additional gameplay feature in Millipede over that of Centipede, which is this little worm thing that goes across the screen. If you manage to hit it, it slows down gameplay, allowing you to pick off your enemies more easily, and giving you a much needed time to breathe. Among other pieces of gameplay returning from the previous game, when you reach 15,000 points you get an extra life. In addition to the cool new additions in Millipede, we also have the addition of additional sounds. Just like in Centipede, each enemy has their own sound, which means that as there are more and more of them on the screen, you get that little warning sign telling you how screwed you are. This really adds a great deal to the game because as the screen is getting more and more hectic as there's more and more enemies cluttered around it, so too does the sound get more and more hectic, really making your adrenaline spike. Because of this, Millipede is one of those games that wouldn't be anywhere near as enjoyable if you were playing it on mute. So there we have it, the storyline, graphics, and sound all have a giant tick in the realm of being better than Centipede. And while it's difficult to illustrate it by just showing footage of the game, I must say that Millipede also has more of that intangible fun factor over that of Centipede. That's not to say that Centipede's not fun. Centipede is extremely fun. Millipede is just more fun. It is overall a better game. However, all of that said and done, it wouldn't be a very fair and thorough review just to compare it to its predecessor. So does Millipede have any flaws? Well, yes it does, but it actually shares those flaws with its predecessor, interesting enough. These are things that they should have improved on, but either couldn't or just simply didn't. The first of these 2 flaws is the lack of multiplayer. In the Centipede review, I lamented the fact that there was no multiplayer, but pointed out that you could just simply swap controllers between each playthrough. I still hold that opinion, but it would have been a great deal of fun to play a 2-player co-op version of this game, not unlike the one that Space Invaders offers. However, considering just how hectic this game is, and considering how much goes on in this game in comparison to Space Invaders, I'm guessing they didn't do it because it was not possible, rather than simply not doing it because they didn't want to. The other thing that they didn't change but probably should have is the artwork on the game cartridge, which is still very lame, and still featuring that ugly warlock thing from the first game. I know they probably try to keep it for consistency's sake, but the thing is, if you create something terrible that sucks, you should probably not be consistent with that, and instead try to avoid it in the future. While I very much hope they fix these 2 things in the next game, I also doubt there will be a next game, because Millipedes are actually the land animal with the most legs, so there's not really a game they can go up to. We've had Centipede and now we've had Millipede, and until we invent an animal with more legs than Millipede, this is going to have to be the last game in the series, unfortunately. Therefore, if you are a scientist and you're watching this show, you have your task. Go out and create an animal with more legs so I can get more of the Centipede series. With all of that said and done, Millipede is a fantastically enjoyable game, which, unlike Starship Troopers 2, managed to stand up to the high standards left by its predecessor. So if you're looking for a fun game to play this Friday night, head down to your local video store and pick up a copy of Millipede on the Atari 2600. If you actually decide to read the manual though, supposedly the game is about a character called Oliver, who is a magic elf and has to defend his mushroom garden using a magic wand he's recently found against evil scorpions, spiders, and pesky fleas. Well, if you ask me, it sounds like Oliver has been sampling his mushroom garden a little bit too much.